Ripley, Ohio. The Ohio River separated two worlds: freedom on the north bank, bondage on the south. John Parker, a formerly enslaved iron foundry owner, stood on the free side, watching Kentucky's dark shoreline where armed patrols hunted human beings every night. Across that black water, families ran for their lives, desperate to reach Ohio soil, and most never made it. The river was controlled, they said. Slave catchers owned both banks. No one escapes here, they boasted, patrolling with dogs, guns, and the law on their side. Parker looked at the water, then at his boat. He had bought his own freedom for $800 after 18 years of brutal labor. Now free and prosperous, he could have lived quietly, safely, building his business and raising his family in peace. Instead, Parker made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of his life. He would cross that river, not once, but over and over, invading Kentucky slave territory to bring people out himself. He loaded pistols, sharpened his knife, and pushed his boat into the current. The patrols would never see him coming. For 20 years, John Parker would become the ghost that haunted every slave catcher on the Ohio River, the one man they could never catch no matter how hard they tried. The Ohio River wasn't just a border, it was a battlefield. Every night, professional slave catchers prowled both banks, armed and organized, hunting human beings for profit. They knew the terrain, controlled the crossings, and maintained networks of informants on both sides. Kentucky planters paid top dollar for captured freedom seekers, and the catchers treated it like a business: systematic, efficient, ruthless. They believed no one could operate under their watch. The river belonged to them. Ripley, Ohio sat directly across from Kentucky's Mason County, one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of the border. Slave catchers worked in teams, coordinating patrols, watching suspected safe houses, interrogating anyone who looked suspicious. Free black people like Parker were especially scrutinized. Anyone helping runaways faced severe penalties, including re-enslavement under Kentucky law if captured on Southern soil. The catchers assumed that fear alone would keep free black citizens on their side of the river, safe and silent. They underestimated John Parker completely. Parker was supposed to be grateful, quiet, and careful. He had bought his freedom for $1,800, a fortune earned through brutal labor in Southern foundries. He owned property, ran a successful ironworks, employed workers, and lived as a respected businessman in Ripley. By every measure, he had everything to lose. Crossing into Kentucky meant risking capture, re-enslavement, or death. The law was clear. Any black person on Kentucky soil without proper documentation could be seized and sold. Free papers meant nothing if slave catchers decided to destroy them, but Parker studied the system like he studied iron, understanding its weaknesses, its breaking points, its vulnerabilities. Slave catchers were confident, but they were also predictable. They patrolled known routes, watched obvious crossing points, and assumed escapees would come to them. They never imagined someone would invade their territory, travel deep into Kentucky on foot, and guide people out under their noses. The idea of a free black man repeatedly entering the South to conduct rescues seemed impossible, suicidal. Parker made it routine. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 raised the stakes even higher, imposing federal penalties on anyone aiding escapees and requiring northern citizens to assist in captures. Slave catchers grew bolder, operating openly in Ohio towns, seizing people in broad daylight, dragging them back across the river in chains. Bounties increased, $1,000 for Parker's capture, dead or alive. Informants were everywhere. One mistake, one betrayal, one unlucky encounter meant torture, sale, or execution. The professional catchers thought they had every advantage: weapons, numbers, legal authority, local knowledge, and the full weight of both state and federal law. They controlled ferry crossings, bribed officials, and maintained constant surveillance. Every escape route was supposedly monitored, every safe house supposedly identified, every conductor supposedly known. What they didn't understand was that Parker wasn't just brave, he was strategic. He studied patrol patterns, memorized back roads, built networks of trusted contacts, and moved with the precision of a military operative. He armed himself with revolvers and a knife, ready to fight if cornered. He operated at night, used signals and codes, and never followed the same route twice. Most importantly, he never stopped. While slave catchers waited at obvious crossings, Parker was 20 miles inland, guiding families through the darkness toward freedom. For nearly 2 decades, the most organized, well-funded slave-catching operation on the Ohio River would be humiliated by one man they thought they could control. The system was about to learn that John Parker couldn't be stopped. Parker's first crossing came on a moonless night in 1845. He pushed his small boat into the Ohio River current, pistols loaded, knife strapped to his belt, every sense alert. The water was black and cold. Kentucky's shoreline loomed ahead, enemy territory where his freedom papers meant nothing and capture meant death or worse. He landed silently, pulled the boat into brush, and moved inland on foot. 20 miles. That's how far Parker would sometimes travel into Kentucky slave territory, navigating by stars and memory, avoiding roads where patrols operated. He carried coded messages from contacts, signals that identified safe locations where desperate families waited in barns, cellars, and woods. One lantern in a window meant proceed, 2 meant danger, no light meant abort. His first rescue was a woman and 2 children hiding in a tobacco barn outside Maysville. Parker found them terrified, certain they'd be caught before sunrise. He calmed them, explained the route, and led them back through the darkness. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle cocking. Every distant dog bark meant possible discovery. They reached the river at dawn, crossed in Parker's boat, and stepped onto Ohio soil as free people. Parker returned to his foundry that morning and went to work like nothing had happened. The rescues became systematic. Parker developed networks of informants, both free black people and sympathetic whites, who passed information about families planning escapes. He memorized patrol schedules, studied river conditions, identified hidden crossing points. When someone needed help, Parker crossed. Sometimes once a week, sometimes multiple times in a single week, always at night, always armed, always ready to fight. The methods were brutal in their simplicity. Parker would receive word that a family was ready to run. He crossed the river after dark, travel inland to the designated location, and guide them back. If they couldn't walk fast enough, he'd carry children. If pursuers got close, he'd hide his group and double back to mislead the dogs. If confronted directly, he'd draw his weapons and make it clear he wasn't surrendering anyone. One encounter became legendary among both abolitionists and slave catchers. Parker was guiding a young woman across Kentucky when a mounted patrol spotted them. The catchers demanded Parker hand her over. Instead, Parker drew both pistols, aimed them at the lead rider, and spoke calmly. "You can try to take her, but you'll die first." The catchers, staring down Parker's barrels, chose to let them pass. The story spread quickly. A free black man had faced down armed slave catchers and won through sheer nerve. Word of Parker's activities reached plantation owners who pooled resources to stop him. A $1,000 bounty was placed on his head, an enormous sum meant to inspire betrayal. Posters went up on both sides of the river describing Parker, offering the reward for his capture or death. Informants were recruited. Patrols were increased. The entire slave-catching apparatus focused on finding and stopping one man. Parker kept crossing. By 1850, when the Fugitive Slave Act made his work even more dangerous, Parker had rescued dozens of people. By 1855, the number was in the hundreds. He destroyed his rescue records that year, burning documents that could have been used to prosecute him or identify the people he'd helped. But the work never stopped. Every night the river called. Every night, somewhere in Kentucky, families waited for the ghost who crossed impossible waters and brought them home. By 1850, John Parker had become a ghost story that slave catchers told in hushed voices. 5 years of operations, hundreds of people rescued, not once captured, The $1,000 bounty remained unclaimed because no one could find him when he crossed, and those who did find him didn't survive the encounter with their pride intact. Parker's legend grew with every successful rescue, and the psychological impact on the slave-catching system was devastating. They couldn't stop one man. The numbers were staggering. By conservative estimates, Parker crossed the Ohio River over 1,000 times between 1845 and 1865. Each crossing was a calculated risk, each rescue a direct challenge to the entire apparatus of bondage. He didn't wait for people to reach the river. He invaded Kentucky territory, sometimes traveling 20 or 30 miles inland to guide families out. While slave catchers watched obvious routes, Parker moved through backwoods and swamps, using stars for navigation and instinct for survival. His methods evolved into military precision. Parker maintained networks of contacts on both sides of the river, trusted allies who passed coded messages about families ready to escape. He memorized patrol schedules, studied river currents, identified dozens of crossing points. When danger mounted, he adapted. When authorities increased patrols, he changed routes. When informants appeared, he fed them false information. The system couldn't predict him because he never established patterns. The rescues themselves were brutal and direct. Parker would receive word through his network: a family hiding in a barn outside Maysville, a man trapped on a plantation near Augusta, children separated from their parents and desperate to run. Parker would cross that night, armed with 2 loaded pistols and a knife, ready to fight if cornered. He'd locate the family, calm their terror, and guide them back through darkness to the river. If they moved too slowly, he'd carry children on his back. If pursuers got close, he'd hide his group and confront the threat directly. One rescue in the mid-1850s became emblematic of Parker's fearlessness. He was guiding a young mother and her infant across Kentucky when a patrol of 3 mounted slave catchers surrounded them at dawn. The lead catcher demanded Parker surrender the woman. Parker's response was immediate. He drew both pistols, aimed them with steady hands, and spoke with chilling calm. "You want her? Come take her. But I promise you'll die before you touch her." The standoff lasted minutes. The catchers, staring down Parker's barrels and recognizing the absolute resolve in his eyes, turned their horses and rode away. The story spread through both abolitionist and pro-slavery circles, evidence that one armed, determined black man could face down the system and win. By day, Parker ran his iron foundry, employed workers, paid taxes, and lived as a respected businessman. By night, he was the enemy every slave catcher feared and couldn't catch. The dual identity was perfect camouflage. Authorities suspected him constantly, but could never prove anything. His house in Ripley became a safe haven where hundreds passed through on their way to permanent freedom, each one adding to the tally of people Parker had stolen from bondage. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made his work exponentially more dangerous, imposing harsh federal penalties and requiring northern citizens to assist in captures. Parker burned his rescue records that year, destroying evidence that could prosecute him or identify the people he'd helped, but he didn't stop. If anything, the increased danger made him more determined. For 15 more years, through the 1850s and into the Civil War, Parker crossed that river, fought that fight, and rescued those families. By 1860, conservative estimates placed his rescues at 400-600 people. Some historians believe the true number exceeded 1,000. Either way, the impact was undeniable. John Parker had humiliated the entire slave-catching apparatus along the Ohio River for 15 years, and no one could stop him. April 1861. The Civil War exploded across America, and John Parker's secret war became part of a larger battle. For 16 years, he had fought alone, crossing the river, rescuing families, humiliating slave catchers who couldn't stop him. Now the entire nation was fighting the same war Parker had been waging in darkness since 1845. His response was immediate and strategic. If the Union needed soldiers, Parker would deliver them. Parker transformed his Underground Railroad network into a recruitment operation for the 27th Regiment U.S. colored troops. The same routes he'd used to guide people to freedom now channeled them toward military service. Men who had escaped bondage with Parker's help returned to fight the system that had enslaved them. Parker crossed into Kentucky, not just to rescue individuals, but to recruit entire groups of freedom seekers willing to take up arms against the Confederacy. Estimates suggest he recruited several hundred black soldiers during the war years, each one a direct blow to the institution he'd been undermining for nearly 2 decades. By day, Parker's iron foundry pivoted to war production, manufacturing supplies for Union forces. His business thrived while his nighttime operations continued without pause. The dual identity that had protected him for years now served a larger military purpose. Authorities who had suspected him for decades suddenly needed him. His foundry's output was essential to the war effort. His recruitment work brought desperately needed soldiers to Union ranks. But Parker never stopped the rescue missions. Even during the war, families still needed guidance across the river. Even with Confederate attention focused on military operations, slave catchers still prowled the Ohio shoreline, hunting human beings for profit. Parker kept crossing, kept rescuing, kept fighting his personal war within the larger conflict. The $1,000 bounty remained unclaimed. The man they couldn't catch for 16 years remained uncatchable through 4 more years of war. The psychological impact of Parker's 2-decade campaign was devastating to the pro-slavery system. Every person he rescued was proof the system could be beaten. Every crossing was evidence that determination and courage could overcome laws, weapons, and institutional power. Slave catchers along the Ohio River, once confident in their control, had been systematically humiliated by one free black man who refused to accept their authority. The legend of Parker's invincibility spread through both abolitionist and pro-slavery communities. Hundreds rescued, thousands of crossings, never captured, never defeated. By 1865, when the war ended and the 13th Amendment abolished the institution Parker had been fighting for 20 years, his personal tally was staggering. Somewhere between 400 and 1,000 people rescued directly, hundreds more recruited for military service. Countless lives changed through his foundry's employment and his community leadership. The system that was supposed to be permanent, unbreakable, and divinely ordained had been systematically dismantled by one man with a boat, 2 pistols, and unshakable resolve. Parker had proven something that would echo through generations. No system of oppression is truly invincible when faced with sustained, intelligent, courageous resistance. The slave catchers who thought they controlled the Ohio River had been utterly defeated by a man they never managed to catch. The war ended in 1865, and John Parker's 20-year personal crusade against bondage officially ended with it. The 13th Amendment made his nighttime crossings unnecessary. No more families hiding in Kentucky barns. No more armed confrontations with patrols. No more $1,000 bounty on his head. Parker returned fully to his iron foundry, the Phoenix Foundry in Ripley, which had operated throughout his rescue missions and now pivoted entirely to peacetime production. But Parker wasn't finished proving himself. The same intelligence and determination that had made him uncatchable for 2 decades now drove him toward innovation. He became an inventor, securing patents for agricultural equipment and industrial devices, a remarkable achievement for any American in the late 1800s, but especially for a black man in that era. His foundry prospered, employing workers and contributing to Ripley's economy. The man who had fought oppression in darkness now built prosperity in daylight. Parker never spoke publicly about his rescue operations while they were happening. Secrecy had been essential to survival. One careless word could have meant capture, prosecution, or death. But in the 1880s, after decades of silence, Parker finally agreed to share his story with journalist Frank Moody Gregg. The interviews revealed the full scope of his operations. Over 1,000 crossings into Kentucky territory, hundreds of people rescued personally, countless confrontations with armed patrols, and a perfect record of never being captured despite a massive bounty and constant surveillance. The stories were astonishing. Parker described wading through icy water, fighting slave catchers hand-to-hand, threatening armed men with pistols at point-blank range, and guiding terrified families through swamps and forests. He detailed the network of contacts, the coded signals, the strategic planning that had made his operations possible. Most remarkably, he explained how he had maintained a dual life for nearly 20 years, respected businessman by day, hunted fugitive by night, without ever being caught. Parker's house in Ripley, which had sheltered hundreds of freedom seekers, became a physical monument to his courage. The same rooms where families had hidden before crossing to permanent freedom remained standing, a testament to one man's refusal to accept injustice. The iron steps he had forged in his own foundry still led to the door where desperate people had knocked, seeking the man who would risk everything to help them. Recognition came slowly but powerfully. Abolitionists who had worked alongside Parker during the dangerous years before the war testified to his extraordinary courage and effectiveness. Historians began documenting his role in the Underground Railroad, recognizing him as one of the most daring and successful conductors in the entire network. The numbers were undeniable. While most conductors helped dozens of people escape, Parker had helped hundreds, possibly over 1,000, through direct personal intervention in enemy territory. Parker died on January 30th, 1900, having lived to see the century turn and the world he had fought to create finally beginning to emerge. His oral memoir, compiled from those 1880s interviews, wouldn't be published until 1996, nearly a century after his death. But when it finally appeared as His Promised Land, it revealed the full scope of his personal war on oppression. The man who had been hunted for 20 years, who had a $1,000 bounty on his head, who had crossed the Ohio River over 1,000 times into hostile territory, had won completely. He died free, prosperous, and respected, everything the system said he could never be. John Parker's legacy extends far beyond the numbers, though the numbers themselves are staggering. Over 1,000 crossings into hostile territory, between 400 and 1,000 people rescued personally through direct intervention, hundreds more recruited for Union military service, a $1,000 bounty that went unclaimed for 20 years, a perfect record of never being captured despite constant surveillance and relentless pursuit. But the true measure of Parker's impact wasn't just who he saved, it was what he proved. Parker proved that one determined individual could dismantle an entire system of oppression through sustained, intelligent resistance. The slave-catching apparatus along the Ohio River, backed by laws, weapons, money, and institutional power, was systematically humiliated by a free black man with a boat and unshakable courage. Every crossing was a direct challenge to the idea that escape was impossible. Every rescue was evidence that the system could be beaten. Every year that Parker operated successfully was proof that determination and strategy could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. His house in Ripley, Ohio, the John P. Parker House, was designated a National Historic Landmark, preserved as a monument to his courage. The same rooms where hundreds of freedom seekers hid before crossing to permanent liberty still stand, a physical testament to one man's refusal to accept injustice. The iron steps Parker forged in his own foundry still lead to the door where desperate families knocked, seeking the man who would risk everything to guide them to freedom. Parker's autobiography, compiled from interviews conducted in 1885 with journalist Frank Moody Gregg, wasn't published until 1996, nearly a century after his death. But when His Promised Land finally appeared, it revealed the full scope of his personal war. The details were astonishing: the strategic planning, the armed confrontations, the narrow escapes, the sheer audacity of repeatedly invading enemy territory for 2 decades. The book became essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the Underground Railroad and the extraordinary individuals who made it work. But Parker's greatest legacy is the inspiration his story provides to every generation that discovers it. In an era when oppression seemed permanent and resistance seemed futile, Parker showed that one person's courage could change everything. He didn't wait for laws to change or society to evolve. He acted repeatedly, risking his life and freedom to ensure others could taste that same freedom he had fought so hard to achieve. The contrast between how Parker's life began and how it ended tells the entire story of his triumph. Born into bondage, bought his own freedom for $1,800, and died in 1900 as a respected businessman, inventor, and community leader. The system said he was property with no future. Parker proved he could not only build a successful life, but simultaneously wage a 20-year war that would save hundreds of lives and inspire countless others. Today, Parker's story resonates with anyone fighting systems of oppression, anyone told they're powerless, anyone facing impossible odds. His message is clear and timeless. Sustained courage, strategic intelligence, and absolute commitment can defeat even the most entrenched systems of injustice. The slave catchers who thought they controlled the Ohio River learned that lesson the hard way. John Parker crossed that river over 1,000 times, rescued hundreds, and was never caught. One man defeated an entire system, and his victory echoes through history as proof that resistance is never futile when backed by unwavering determination.